Section 12, Education and Conciliation, Arizona Fair Housing 101. Fair housing doesn't end with a sale. One afternoon, after finishing another successful closing, Sarah walked into David's office carrying a transaction file. "I think I'm finally starting to understand fair housing," she said. David smiled. "That's good. But let me ask you something. When does fair housing end?" Sarah thought for a moment. "When escrow closes?" David laughed. "That's what most new agents think. The truth is, fair housing affects much more than buying and selling homes." He opened a copy of the Fair Housing Act. The law applies to nearly every part of a residential real estate transaction. Fair housing covers more than sales. David explained that fair housing protections extend well beyond listing and selling homes. The law applies to many residential real estate-related transactions, including mortgage lending and financing, home improvement loans, property appraisals, residential brokerage services, leasing and property management, residential real estate sales. "Think about it," David said. "A buyer's opportunity to own a home doesn't depend only on finding the right property. They also need financing. They need an appraisal. They need insurance. They need equal treatment throughout the entire process. If discrimination occurs at any point, it can prevent someone from obtaining housing." Sarah nodded. "So fair housing protects the entire transaction." "Exactly. Equal access to brokerage services," David continued. "The law also protects access to brokerage services. Real estate professionals cannot deny someone access to brokerage services, MLS participation, or other real estate services because of a protected characteristic." Sarah smiled. "So fair housing isn't just about our clients. It also applies to how our industry operates." David nodded. "Every consumer deserves equal professional service, and every qualified licensee deserves equal access to participate in the real estate profession." "What about appraisals?" Sarah remembered hearing news stories about appraisal discrimination. "How does fair housing apply to appraisers?" David explained that appraisers are expected to develop opinions of value based upon objective market data, not personal characteristics of the homeowner or occupants. The value should come from the property and the market, never from the people living there. If an appraiser intentionally allows protected characteristics to influence an appraisal, that may violate fair housing laws as well as professional appraisal standards. "Fair housing reaches every part of the transaction," David reminded her. Understanding limited exemptions. Sarah noticed another section discussing exemptions. "So there are times when fair housing doesn't apply?" "There are very limited exemptions," David replied. "Certain religious organizations and qualifying private clubs may receive limited exemptions under specific circumstances established by federal law. However, those exemptions are narrow and should never be assumed to apply to an ordinary residential real estate transaction. As licensees," David explained, "our safest approach is to assume fair housing applies unless qualified legal counsel determines a lawful exemption exists." Housing for older persons. Sarah turned another page. "This mentions 55-plus communities." David nodded. "One of the most misunderstood exemptions. Certain communities may qualify as housing for older persons under federal law. Generally, qualifying communities must meet specific statutory requirements, including occupancy standards and policies demonstrating the intent to operate as housing for older persons. For many 55-plus communities, at least 80% of the occupied units must be occupied by at least one person who is 55 years of age or older." David reminded Sarah that age-restricted communities must continue to comply with other applicable fair housing protections, including those involving disability and reasonable accommodations. Being a 55-plus community doesn't eliminate every fair housing obligation. Sarah immediately remembered the Arizona case they had discussed earlier, involving a disabled child living with a parent in an age-restricted community. Now I understand why that case was so important. Education before enforcement. Sarah looked at the last section. It talks about education and conciliation. David smiled. "And that's one of my favorite parts of the Fair Housing Act. The government certainly has the authority to investigate complaints, but Congress also recognized something important. Many fair housing problems can be prevented through education. HUD continues to provide training materials, publications, outreach programs, and educational resources to help consumers, housing providers, landlords, brokers, and real estate professionals understand their responsibilities before problems occur. When people understand the rules," David said, "they're much more likely to follow them." Resolving problems through conciliation. Sarah asked, "So what happens if someone files a fair housing complaint?" David explained that many complaints are first evaluated to determine whether they can be resolved through conciliation. Conciliation is an informal process that encourages the parties to communicate, negotiate, and voluntarily resolve disputes whenever possible. If the parties reach an agreement, they may sign a written conciliation agreement outlining how the matter will be resolved. Not every complaint ends in a courtroom. Sometimes, education, communication, and cooperation solve the problem long before litigation becomes necessary. Sarah smiled. I've noticed something throughout this course. What's that? The Fair Housing Act isn't just about enforcing the law. It's also about helping people understand the law. David nodded. Exactly. The best fair housing complaint is the one that never happens because everyone knew the rules before the transaction began. Arizona broker tip. One of the best ways to reduce fair housing complaints is through continuing education. Regularly reviewing fair housing laws, brokerage policies, advertising practices, and office procedures helps ensure that every client receives consistent, professional service while reducing legal risk for everyone involved. Online discussion question. Why does the Fair Housing Act apply to more than just the sale of residential property? Obtaining housing involves many services beyond the purchase contract, including financing, appraisals, brokerage services, leasing, and property management. Fair housing protections apply throughout the housing process to ensure equal access at every stage. Question 2. Why does the Fair Housing Act emphasize education and conciliation in addition to enforcement? Answer. Many fair housing violations can be prevented when housing providers understand their legal responsibilities. Education promotes compliance, while conciliation allows many disputes to be resolved without lengthy litigation. Question 3. Why should Arizona real estate professionals be cautious when relying on fair housing exemptions? Answer. Most exemptions are narrow and apply only under specific legal circumstances. Licensees should not assume an exemption applies without consulting their designated broker or qualified legal counsel.